Hello and welcome to the Point Blank Show. My name is Abhishek, and joining me today is author, speaker, podcaster, investigative journalist Geoff White, who has written a brilliant book titled Rinsed, which tells the story of how the tech industry washes money for the world's deadliest crooks. Thanks a lot for doing this, Geoff.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you. And for those who are listening in, I'm holding Geoff's book onto the screen. You can see this on YouTube. And the one thing that I loved, I know you should not judge a book by its cover, but it's got $100 bill hanging from a clothesline with computer code dripping off it to depict money laundering or washing of money. That's brilliant. Meaning, how much of a say do you have in before we get into the subject of the book itself, how did you get around the illustration?
That's interesting, actually. Most authors, I think, are in the same position where you have a say, but ultimately it's the publisher who makes the final decision. We went through a number of different options with the cover, and I wanted something that was quite striking and quite grabby, and instantly said, well, the three things the book's about: money, laundering, and tech. And obviously you've got money, it's being laundered, and the sort of computer code dripping off the $100 bill implies that it's about tech. So I thought that kind of encapsulated everything in the one image.
And you've covered financial crime and cryptocurrency and money laundering for 20 years, and you speak at events. You also help companies to figure out how to get more savvy when it comes to security. For organized crime that you've covered for so long, what do you find so fascinating about it? What interests you about this subject, which we've watched in movies, but you're on the ground trying to find problems that you can report on?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the thing that I find fascinating about organised crime, the clue is in the name. It's organised. I mean, Abhishek, I'm sure you like me, you've worked for an organisation before, and if something goes wrong, if they don't pay you, for example, at the end of the month, well, you can go maybe to the police or to the courts, or you can sue or something like that. You've got legitimate sort of ways of complaining. In an organised crime operation, you can't do that. You know, if you're dealing with a drug gang and they don't pay you for the drugs you've sold for them, you can't go to the police. And so you have to have an organisation of people, a group of people working together. But these people are inevitably, obviously not to be trusted because they're criminals. So how do you do business with people that you can't trust when you've got no possibility of going to the police or the courts or the government to enforce your contracts? Now, what's interesting is the traditional answer to that has been violence. So if you don't pay me, I will come and shoot you or break your legs. Well, in modern crime, financial crime and cybercrime, the people who are doing the crimes in the organisation, they're scattered across the world. They don't know where each other lives. They often don't know who these other people are. They can be anonymous people on the internet. So if you haven't got the threat of violence, how do you enforce a contract if you can't enforce it legally? I find the systems of trust in these organised crime operations really, really interesting.
And how do you go about? See, there are two kinds of journalists. One who look at secondary research, things have been written about in the past, then you do analysis and try to give your verdict, whereas you are probably out in places where your family might be worried about, is what I would imagine. How is your kind of journalism different? Can you give me an example of something where you've had to follow a lead, you follow different rabbit holes to find something that nobody has ever written about and then strike gold, or not?
Yes, I think that's the definition of investigative journalism, is simply doing what the other journalists won't do, and I suspect, I don't know what my hit rate is, but I suspect a high percentage of the exercises most journalists, investigative journalists, do just end in failure. It's just you never see the results of that because it doesn't, generate anything. I think the craziest thing I did was in my first book, Crime.com, I wanted to begin the book with one of the first real computer viruses, certainly one of the first big computer viruses, which is called the love bug, which people may remember back in 2000. It went around the world. It was disguised as a love letter, and it was auto-spreading. So it spread around the world. It caused huge problems. It was never quite clear who actually did that and who perpetrated it. There were some suspicions it was someone in the Philippines, in Manila, and there was a name was bandied about, but that person was never arrested because there was no laws against hacking in the Philippines at that point. And so it was always this big mystery. So I started trying to think, well, if I could find this chap, his name was Onel de Gutzman, if I could find Onel, then I could maybe ask him about it. And I read online on a forum that he used to work in a particular market in a particular area of the Philippines, in a mobile phone shop. And so I thought, well, I was going to the Philippines anyway for another story. I thought I'll go to this market and I'll just find the phone shop and maybe he'll be there. And of course, when I arrived, there were 30 phone shops. Yes. So I wrote his name down on a piece of paper and started showing his name to people at these shops. And at the time, I almost had an out-of-body experience of how stupid this was, because it's obviously not going to work. And yet, somebody said, oh yes, I know him. He doesn't work here anymore, but he works across town at a different shop, and here's where you can find him. And so I caught a taxi across town thinking, well, this is another waste of time. But sure enough, I turned up at the shopping centre. I waited 5 or 6 hours, and finally, there he was. And when I asked him about it, for the first time in 20 years, he admitted it. He said, yes, it was me. Wow. I did it. And here's how it all worked out. So you try and do the thing that nobody else does. Most of the time that doesn't work, but actually sometimes you strike gold. And when you do, obviously that's, I think people take that quite seriously.
And I hope you celebrate that with a pizza or a drink of your choice whenever you make these discoveries. And let's talk about Rinsed. If you could briefly explain the premise, because you've written quite a bit over the last 2 decades. What is it that you wanted to convey this time around after having written Lazarus Heist as well, which is another beautiful book about how North Korea is a crazy place when it comes to hacking, among other things. So what's the premise of this one?
Yeah, that's interesting. So, as you say, the previous book I worked on, and it was also a BBC podcast series, was called The Lazarus Heist, which is about North Korea and how North Korea became this kind of computer hacking superpower, which is a very unlikely turn of events if you think about it, because a lot of people in North Korea don't have a computer, let alone access to the internet. And yet North Korea has caused these, is blamed for these huge cyber attacks. So how that worked out became the subject of Lazarus Heist. But what was interesting was the accusation is North Korea's hackers are stealing money. The country is subject to sanctions, it's run out of money, it needs cash, and so its hackers, all countries, the UK, India, all countries have government hackers, we all have them, but North Korea's hackers, the accusation is, are trying to get money to prop up the regime, to help the regime survive. Now, that gets you into interesting territory because, of course, North Korea then has to steal the money, but has to get it back to North Korea without getting caught. And so that led them to money laundering. And actually, about half of the Lazarus Heist story is actually about money laundering. It's actually what happens with the money and how they hide it and move it and so on. And so I started getting interested in money laundering. And I realised there was this whole edifice of people. I think people have this idea computer hackers know it all. They've got skills like you wouldn't believe. But actually, a lot of the time when a computer hacker breaks in somewhere, they want to steal money, they don't necessarily know what to do with it. You can't send it to your own account. You're going to get caught immediately. So hackers know they have to do something with the money to disguise it and to extricate it, but they don't really know what. And so often the hackers will go to a money launderer and say, look, I've got access, I'm going to steal this money, can you help me launder it? And then I realised, of course, that those launderers weren't just working with computer hackers, they're working with all types of organised crime, because organised crime makes money. So prostitution, drug dealing, child sexual abuse, fraud, they all make money, and they're all relying on these groups of money launderers, who increasingly, of course, are high-tech people. Money has gone high-tech, finance is digital. So these money launderers needed to become high-tech specialists as well. And so that's what the book Rinsed is about.
And in layman's terms, Geoff, if you could explain what money laundering 101 is. It's for somebody who just wants to understand how that works. It's in the news. For example, in India, I think you may have read a lot about Hawala scandal, which is basically, how if I were to transfer $100 to you, I would send that equivalent amount of rupees to a handler in India, and his contact will do the same in your bank account, which was very in the 90s. In school, we grew up to these news where many politicians went behind bars. But it's far more complicated than that, is what I read in your book. So what is money laundering 101, if you were to explain to someone?
Well, I think the best way to think about it is to put yourself in the shoes of the criminal. Imagine you've been dealing some drugs and you've made, I don't know, 1 million rupees, let's say. You've now got cash. Now, that's suspicious, because if you're caught with all that cash, the police can ask questions of you. Where did you get this cash? Secondly, one of your fellow criminals might steal it from you. It's vulnerable. Also, it's bulky. Cash is quite a bulky thing to have around, and it's hard to spend. If you walk into a a car showroom or something with all that cash. Again, the car dealer, increasingly, they're forced by law to ask questions of people who come in with lots of cash. Cash is suspicious. So you want to try and get that cash into a financial system, ideally a bank account. And then it looks legitimate. It's like, oh, I've not got cash anymore, but I've got $1 million in the bank, and it's less suspicious than cash. The problem, of course, is you walk into a bank with $1 million rupees, they're going to ask questions. So what you'll do is you'll do what's called the first stage of money laundering. It's called a placement, is getting it into a financial system using some kind of excuse. So let's imagine you go into the bank and you say, hey, I own a hairdresser business, and they pay me in cash, and here's my $1 million rupees that I've made from all my haircuts that I've done. Now, the bank might think, well, you do own a hairdresser, I suppose that's feasible. So immediately you've got your money into the bank. The problem is if the police then catch you for your drug dealing, they see your hairdresser's business, they see the bank account, they realise all the money in the bank account is from your drug dealing, they seize the money, and you've lost the money, and you're going to prison for dealing drugs. So the next stage of money laundering is called layering. You take your $1 million rupees that you've got in the bank, and maybe you move it to a different account and a different account. Maybe you withdraw it and put it back into another bank. Maybe you change it to gold or Bitcoin, a cryptocurrency. The whole point of that is, even if the police catch you for your drug dealing, they can put you in prison for drug dealing, but your money is safe because the police can't prove that that $1 million rupees was your drug money. So when you come out of prison, having done maybe a few years, maybe more, your money's still there. You don't have to start again. And so the final stage of money laundering is what's called integration. This is when you take that money that's now clean of any connection to the crime and you start spending it. And you might think, well, maybe you spend it on, champagne or, as you say, pizzas and beers. But actually, if you're a smart criminal, you spend it on something that's going to give you a long-term return. Something like property, maybe you might buy an apartment. And that way, again, you're gaining money. You're gaining legitimate money, so that tax authorities can't investigate you and so on. And again, if you do go to prison, when you come out, your apartment is still there for you. So that's the basics of money laundering. By the way, don't do this. It's illegal. And also those steps I've described, they're well known. I mean, everybody who studies money laundering, they know about it. But that's the basics of why you do it and how you do it.
So it's more like your retirement is safe for these criminals who get out of prisons if they have tried to do it right. But it's hard work then, isn't it? If in the first book as well, rather in the Lazarus Heist as well, you talk about how it's far more difficult to know how to do this than to pull off a heist in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, the North Koreans are accused of breaking into the National Bank of Bangladesh, as I'm sure a lot of your listeners will know, in 2015 to 2016. They managed to take out $81 million from the Bank of Bangladesh. But of course, again, they've got that problem. Where do you send it? You can send it from the bank to your own account or Kim Jong-un's account in North Korea, but it's obvious who's done it. So what they did instead was sent it to the Philippines, where they withdrew it from a bank in the Philippines in cash. There's a lot of cash. It took them 2 trucks to get the cash out. But of course, then, you've got cash, which, as we've talked about, is difficult and bulky and suspicious and so on. They took the cash to a couple of casinos in the Philippines, and they gambled it in the casinos. Now, again, your listeners might be thinking, well, what's the point of that? You're just going to lose your money in the casino. Well, when they went to the casino, they didn't go into the casino that you and I go into. They went into special rooms inside these casinos that are only for high-value customers. And of course, the people who were laundering the money had hired out these rooms, and everybody doing the gambling in those rooms was working with the money launderers. So everybody in there was controlled. And the game they were playing was called Baccarat, which apparently if you play Baccarat very well, you can get back about 90% of what you put in. So the people who put the 81 million into the casino, under very controlled conditions, they gambled it, but they knew when they were gambling that they were going to get back most of what they put in. They then take the cash out of the casino, and it's winnings from a casino. How do you prove that the cash that went in is the winnings that went out? You've broken that chain. It's that layering stage. They've broken the chain between the crime and the money. And from then on, the money just disappears. We think it ends up in Macau, eventually perhaps North Korea. But the money laundering job is gone. It's worth saying, though, that the stuff the North Koreans are doing now, allegedly, is breaking into cryptocurrency organizations and stealing crypto. Now, obviously, if you think about it, cryptocurrency is already digital. You can move it around. You've not got truckloads of cash. So perhaps inevitably the North Koreans, like a lot of criminals, have gone high tech because they've realized it's a lot easier to steal with ones and zeros than it is with wads of banknotes.
That needs a lot of discipline then, doesn't it? Meaning, you also write that there are folks who would come from 9 to 5. It was a job for them to gamble, and they would leave at the right time because they were hired to spend that money and make some thing back of it. Now, when we talk about money laundering, images of Breaking Bad or Scarface, Al Pacino, they come to fore where, they're counting wads of money. How has that changed over time? You did talk about cryptocurrency a minute ago. How do you see the transition from when you started covering 20 years ago to today?
Well, one of the stories I cover in the book, in Rinsed, in fact, one of the first chapter, is about a couple of drug dealers in the north of England, a place called Manchester in the north of England. Two sisters, middle-aged sisters in their 40s, who on the surface looked like they were running a beauty business. They sold beauty products, but actually in their spare time they were drug dealers. They were shipping in large amounts of heroin and selling it in the UK. Now, they had the problem that we talked about, which is they were selling the drugs on the street for cash. They were having to hire couriers to move the cash around, to drive it from place to place. And of course, those couriers get stopped by the police, and the police look at the cash and it's very suspicious. So again, these two drug dealers started thinking, well, how can we make the money more usable for us? How can we make it work better for us? And what they discovered was that they could change it into cryptocurrency, into Bitcoin in this case. So they found a person who was prepared to take their cash, not ask any questions about where it came from, change that cash into Bitcoin, and then, usefully for the gang, for the drug dealers, Bitcoin can be sent anywhere around the world almost instantly without any questions being asked by sort of traditional banks and so on. So immediately the gang hit upon this idea of, well, if we can get it into Bitcoin, we can send it overseas and we can use it to buy more drugs and sell those drugs and so on. And what's interesting is when the gang got caught, because eventually they did, again, the police were able to seize all of their fancy cars and their fancy clothes and watches because they could trace all that back. But the cryptocurrency, the police didn't seize. They couldn't seize that because they couldn't link it. They couldn't find it and link it to the crime. So again, when those sisters come out of prison, it's possible that their cryptocurrency, their Bitcoin they had, is going to be sitting there waiting for them, potentially worth a lot more money than when they went in, depending on how Bitcoin's price does. So you see in that example how traditional street-based, Breaking Bad, Scarface type crime has actually worked with these organized crime money launderers, the high-tech money launderers, to take on a whole different hue.
And now, these crooks or money launderers sitting behind computer screens are quite intelligent. They can do a lot of damage just sitting with nothing except a can of Coke, maybe. And then on the other side, you have organizations who may be listed on the stock exchanges, but they must be great at doing their core job, whether it is selling, beverage or whatever. But their security teams may not be as good as these crooks.
I do sympathise with people who are trying to take charge of the security and particularly digital technology, IT security of an organisation. I think we have this idea that, you can just install antivirus and that'll be fine. I don't think people realise quite how complicated today's business technology is. Any company will have between a handful and thousands of different types of software running on their computers. So they will have outsourced a particular function. The marketing department needs a particular type of software, so they install that computer program. The company needs to do, some auditing, some accounting, so they install some accounting software. Every time a company installs somebody else's software or relies on somebody else's systems, they've opened up a little hole, a little chink in their own armour. And you've got to look at that and think, could the hackers make their way in there? And what we've had, only in the past week, at the time we're recording this podcast anyway, in the last week, is difficulties around software made by a company called CrowdStrike, a security company. Now, other organisations, other businesses, hired CrowdStrike to give them software to make them secure. And CrowdStrike would send them the software, these businesses would install that software, and what it did was monitored for hackers breaking in. But in order to do that, CrowdStrike software had to sit at a very deep level within those companies, within those organizations' computer networks. And it had big privileges, big rights over what to do. Now, it seems CrowdStrike made a mistake. They updated their software and the update had a flaw in it, a problem in it. And it basically crashed thousands of machines around the world, causing all sorts of problems, airlines and all that kind of thing. So it just gives you an insight into quite how complicated this world has become. Right now, I'm sure businesses around the world If they're not doing this, they should be doing this. I was sitting there thinking, well, if CrowdStrike's software, if it goes wrong, can cause that problem, what are all the other pieces of software that we're running, and how many of them could also cause us that same problem? Can I have a list on my desk, please? So it gives you an insight into how hard it is to keep your organization secure.
And for all the wanted prowess of antiviruses and artificial intelligence wanting to predict where the next attack will come from, the weakest link is still the employee, isn't it? Because if that person clicks on an email that he shouldn't be clicking on or she shouldn't be clicking on, things can be bad. I think you've written in your first book around the Cosmos Cooperative Bank in India, where something similar happened and they lost a lot of money.
Exactly so. It's a depressing truth that in 2024 it is still phishing messages. Email, yes, but also things like LinkedIn messages and WhatsApp messages. That they are still the way the hackers get in. They're still the sort of weapon of choice for computer hackers. And if you think about it, that's kind of logical, because it's a numbers game, as a hacker. The more attempts you make, the more likely you are to have a success. If an organization has 1,000 employees, well, you can send 1,000 emails and 1,000 phishing messages, 1,000 LinkedIn messages to those employees. You've got 1,000 chances. If you're trying to hack their computer server, there's one computer server, you've really got one chance there. So targeting the employees, and also the employees, you can keep targeting them again and again and again. You've got multiple goes. And sure enough, eventually one employee will click on the link, open the attachment. Just receiving the message, it almost always isn't enough. You have to do something. You have to click on the link, open the attachment. And so the game of the hackers is to trick you into doing that. But yeah, that's still often the way in. And in the Cosmos Bank case, big bank in India that I'm sure your listeners are familiar with, the hackers, again, alleged to be North Korea, sent a phishing email. And the way they targeted the employees at Cosmos Bank was offering them a prize. They said, you've won a competition, click here to claim your prize. And sure enough, somebody sort of fell for that. So, I guess the piece of advice for your listeners is any message you receive online, whether it's an email or LinkedIn message or Facebook, WhatsApp, whatever, suspect that message, even if it looks like it's come from somebody that you know or something that you trust, particularly if it's asking you to open an attachment or click on a link. Just take 2 seconds to look at that and think, hang on, is this legitimate or not?
These phishing drills, do you think they help? Organizations run them, but time and again, the number of people hopefully will go down, but it's never zero. So it's a bit of luck then. You're as good as the, I mean, not to be condescending, but the dumbest cyber secure employee then.
Yeah, it's going to be a mix of tactics. They talk about layered security and security in depth things. You're right. Companies carry out these phishing tests where they send out a phishing email to their employees and see how many of them click on it. And if they do click on it, they say, you need some training as to what to look out for. That's, as you say, that's not going to spot everybody. Some people will still be clicking on dodgy messages and dodgy links and attachments and so on. But look, you can do that. But simultaneously, what you're also trying to do is beef up your tech security so that even if somebody does click on the link, the hackers don't have access to everything, or the hackers' viruses get stopped at a particular point. So it's a mix of tactics. No tactic will solve everything, because if it did, we'd all be doing it. But if you have the mix of tactics, you can usually crack down. And look, it's still worth doing it. The problem with those phishing tests is people can get used to it or bored of it. It's kind of keeping the thing moving and keeping the scene moving is the important thing with that.
Yes, and from the point of view of these criminals who've got money and want to look online to launder it, let's say they have the money, but they don't know whom to go to. It's not like you pick up the phone or Google it. So is there a Google for the dark web where, just like on Amazon, you've got a book, like your book, it's got a good rating? How does that work? And this is not to suggest that this podcast is not an education for those guys, but how does it work? Yeah.
Don't do this, but it is illegal. But look, you're absolutely right. What you're looking for is collaborators who can help you. If you break into a bank, for example, as North Korea is accused of doing in Cosmos Bank's example, they needed, at that point, by the way, with Cosmos, they broke into the ATM system. So what they were able to do was any ATM around the world, if somebody approached that ATM with a Cosmos bank card and stuck the bank card in, they could demand any amount of money with using any PIN. Now that's great, but for the hackers, they then had to go, okay, well, we need people in every country around the world that we can find with Cosmos bank cards going to those ATMs. How do we do that? How do we do that laundering cash out process? Well, they went to the dark web. They started finding accomplices on the dark web. And there are these forums where you can go, and if you say, I have access to this bank, I need help cashing out the money, there'll be people who reply to you saying, I can help you do that. And again, in the Cosmos Bank case, we know that happened. We know that a couple of collaborators who went by the nicknames Big Boss and Hush Puppy helped the North Koreans cash out that money. So yeah, and interestingly, on these forums, you're exactly right. There are star ratings for people. If you do a good job for somebody, they leave you a good review, your star rating will improve on these sites. But again, going back to that first point about organised crime and how organised crime gets trust between people who are inevitably not to be trusted. Well, that's part of it. These forums, these star ratings, the sort of community opinion of somebody matters a lot, because if it goes wrong, you can't break their legs or kill them because you don't know where they are. So you've got to trust them somehow. So star ratings are absolutely part of that.
And social media too has changed the way people are wooing others to, con them. And I think you yourself had tried as an experiment to reach back to one of the social media influencers with some million followers who was trying to con people, bilk them. So how did that work? Just how was that experience, and how does social media angle come in to all this?
Yes, well, this was interesting. This was the crazy tale of Hush Puppy, the money launderer I talked about, who ended up working with the North Koreans. Hush Puppy was an amazing character, originally from Nigeria, ends up in Dubai, where he creates a life as an Instagram influencer. He has 2.3 million followers on Instagram. And if you looked at his account, you would assume that his life was this charmed existence of, wearing designer clothes, taking private jets, going to exclusive events. But of course, in order to do that, you have to have money. Where was the money coming from? Well, it turned out he was laundering money for, among others, the North Koreans. But interestingly, that idea online of showing your wealth and exhibiting your wealth is a tactic that money launderers use a lot, because what they're often after is getting people to lend them their bank accounts. So again, if I have somebody who's stolen money and I want to help them launder the money, I need bank accounts that they can put that money into, that we can wash the money through. So often what you'll see on social media is people, showing off big wads of cash and sitting in expensive cars with expensive watches. And they'll say, if you want this kind of money, contact me. And actually what's going on there is that person's recruiting money mules whose bank accounts can be used for laundering money.
And I love this line from your book about social media. Meritless narcissism could generate a limitless income stream. That's what you say about social media. And Hush Puppies, I think his name Abbas, if I remember it right, from yes, and you spotted him posing in his pictures with one of his feet turned at an awkward angle because he wanted to show the brand that he was endorsing. So it's a little, it's over the top, but people fall for it, as luck would have it.
Absolutely, yeah. Hush Puppy's existence seemed a charmed existence. And actually, we spoke to somebody who knew him in Dubai and went to visit him. And of course, the inevitable question was, well, didn't you know he was a criminal? And the answer was really interesting from this chap, because he said, well, no, lots of people in Dubai are rich. I had no reason to suspect that his money came from anything dodgy. He didn't tell me that. I didn't, And he said, how often do you interrogate your friends? If a friend of yours is wealthy, how often do you say, well, is that criminal money? You tend not to do that. And so it's quite easy for people, in a way, who have lots of wealth from crime, to just brazen it out and to say, yes, I'm rich and here's my money. Hush Puppy did that, to a huge degree, but other people are doing it as well. You may have, who knows, you may have friends who are well off and actually it turns out the money's dodgy. Who knows?
How do you get to speak to these people, Geoff? You find people from rabbit holes, or you go from one shop to the next. I think Secret Service agent also contacted you on LinkedIn.
Well, look, frankly, a lot of what I do is reading documents, boring legal documents, boring technical reports, and so on. So I just want to make clear, a lot of what I cover is stuff that's already out there in the public domain. It's just that nobody's really read it, and even if they have read it, they haven't sort of turned it into an interesting story. So that's kind of what I do. Most of what I do is stuff that if you, Abhishek, went to the internet, you would find it. It's just you'd find it and it wouldn't be very, very interesting to you. So that I find the stuff and I turn it into interesting stuff. But as part of that, often I'll think, well, hang on, in this story, there's a person who hasn't been interviewed yet or hasn't spoken, and if I can find that person, they've got the answers to all of this. And sometimes I do get approached by people. I mean, you mentioned there the Secret Service. In the Lazarus heist, I talked about that case, the Big Boss Hush Puppy case, that famous money laundering for the North Koreans case that leads back to this Instagram influencer in Dubai. And the Secret Service agent, a chap called Matt O'Neill, contacted me on LinkedIn and said, I enjoyed the Lazarus heist, he said, but you attributed that case to the FBI. And actually, it was a Secret Service case, or at least we did a lot of the work on it. Can we talk? And so he ended up doing an interview. And I discovered all of this information that wasn't in the public domain. Because, of course, what the Secret Service and the FBI will put out, they want to look good. They don't want to look like they ever make mistakes. But frankly, in every investigation, there's always twists and turns. There's always problems. And so when you speak to the investigators, that's when you find out the real story of what actually happened. And so Matt told me that whole story, which is now in the new book, Rinsed. But it's interesting. People, sometimes I work really hard to find people. Sometimes people come out of the woodwork. I mean, there's a very surprising one with Rinsed where, to go back to the two sisters I talked about, the Manchester sisters, one of their couriers who was driving their money around got arrested and did a few years in prison. And I reached out to him on Facebook because he'd come out of prison at this point, and I tried to interview him. He didn't want to be interviewed. But the next day, his dad, his father, phoned me up to ask why I was wanting to speak to his son. And I said, well, I want to interview for this book. The father said, oh, don't bother. My son he's not guilty. He was, it was a dodgy investigation, etc., etc. When I went back to the police, I mentioned this, and they said, oh, well, did his father tell you about his own criminal conviction? Which, of course, he didn't. And it turned out that he owes £25 million to the British government for a VAT scam. And so sometimes I'm not even looking for people, but they sometimes come out of the woodwork anyway, put themselves on my radar.
After you've seen whatever you've seen over the years, what are the things that have actually blown your mind that, oh, I've seen everything, is something that you might say one day and suddenly you find, oh my goodness, there's a lot more. What are a couple of things, if I put you on a spot and say, you found this is crazy, I have never seen anything like this before?
Well, the sort of final chapter of the book, I wanted a sort of payoff chapter of Rinsed to finish on something big. And I'd heard about a hack attributed again to North Korea, a raid on a video game, back in 2022. And as I looked into this, the story just got weirder and weirder. I mean, for a start, breaking into a video game isn't what you'd expect. I mean, you'd expect to break into a bank or an insurance company or a crypto company. But of course, this video game, like a lot of games, making huge amounts of money. It was valued at $2 billion at one point, the company that made the video game. The hackers suspected North Koreans broke in and stole the money because players were investing in this game. They were buying characters in the game to play the game. And they stole $625 million, which is a huge amount of money. It's hard to find another case where that amount of money has been stolen in one go from one victim, valued at the time of the theft. Obviously, from years ago, there were thefts that will now be worth more than 625 million, but at the time of the theft. So that was striking. And then as I looked into it, I realised that they'd managed to transfer this money out of the video game because, of course, it's all digital currency. Again, you're not looking at banknotes anymore. They managed to transfer the money out in 1 minute and 55 seconds, which is the fastest crime of all time by a long margin. And then what was mad was they obviously then have cryptocurrency. This was all in the form of crypto. But of course, that's traceable. As a lot of your listeners will know, cryptocurrency moves across this thing called a blockchain, a publicly available online ledger. And so you can track the movements. You can see where it went. So, of course, they've got $500 million, but they now are under the glare of the spotlight. And so what they did was they took the money to what's called a cryptocurrency mixer, a thing called Tornado Cash, which takes in crypto and mixes it around and then spits it out to a fresh wallet address. And this is set up partly for privacy reasons, if you want to keep your crypto private, which you might do for legitimate reasons. But obviously for the North Koreans, this was the getaway vehicle. And so they managed to launder the money through Tornado Cash. Now, you would have thought Tornado Cash was a underground secretive service, but no, it was a public service. It was above the board and well publicized and advertised. And once North Korea did this, the US government put sanctions on Tornado Cash, cracked down on Tornado Cash. The tech and crypto community are now fighting back and saying, well, yes, $500 million did get laundered through this service, But we still need that service because we need privacy. So privacy is so important to us that actually, if the cost is $500 million by a criminal, well, that's the cost. So it's an amazing story, but it also ends up in this amazing freedom of speech and privacy debate that's still going on in the US at the moment.
No, wasn't there an iPhone that was used by one of the terrorists in the US, and Apple refused to let the government peek into it, and then they managed to do it anyway. And last couple of questions in terms of regulation. It's usually the regulators catch up much after the technology is mature, or they're always playing a catch-up game. They may not even have the right recruitment. I'm not sure how is it. You need to have really intelligent folks who are geeks, who understand how a criminal mind works. So just like Catch Me If You Can, Frank Abagnale, do you have that kind now happening more and more in tech, or should it happen more? What's the answer to all of this?
Yes, is the short answer. In tech security, there's a lot of former hackers or people who've maybe got a conviction who sometimes get hired by tech security companies to advise them. There's a lot of people who've been through those experiences who are advising tech security companies. In terms of cybercrime, the regulations are usually fairly well drawn up, certainly in places like the UK and India and so on. The problem is, of course, you may have the laws in place, but finding and convicting the person, who's probably in a completely different country, is going to be difficult. In cryptocurrency, the regulation is lagging well behind, particularly in the US. From what I've read of it, I don't think the US government can even decide what cryptocurrency is, whether it's a currency or whether it's shares or a commodity or a security. And that's not just, different words. That dictates how it gets policed and how it gets regulated. They desperately need, I think, the US to catch up and start sorting this out. In Europe, doing a bit better. There's some new legislation around crypto that's starting to crack down. But in terms of catching up with the criminals, it's often described as whack-a-mole, that game where a mole pops up and you try and hit it with a hammer, a fake mole, I should say. For me, that's not the right analogy. What happens is it goes in waves. A big crime enterprise will gather speed and gather momentum and pull more and more criminals in, and it will seem unstoppable and unassailable and make loads of money. And then it gets to the level where law enforcement see it, find out about it, penetrate it and take it down. And for a while, things cool down and ease off. And then the next sort of wave, the next big criminal enterprise, criminal gang or criminal tactic comes along and lifts up and then gets big. So it's a sort of almost a wave effect going on is how I'd see it.
And the last one, Geoff, in terms of writing a book of this kind, on the ones that you've written from the investigative journalism point of view, how do you manage to fact check and double check? How important is that? Something that is in the news almost every day these days, where whether it's, these days misinformation is all over the place, and such books are a pleasant reminder that the facts are out there and they need to be reported, and very few people manage to do it. You are part of that community. How important is fact checking, and how do you go about it?
It's extremely important is the direct answer, and I do as best as I can with it. I'm intensely aware that when you publish a book, you are putting something on the record, and people will be reading it and expecting it to be true and potentially relying on it. And it stands in stone. A book is forever, or at least for quite a long time. So you want to make sure you've got everything as solid as you can. If you read my books, you'll see there are footnotes, and there are some sentences where there are 2 or 3 footnotes in one sentence, because I want people to know, particularly if I quote a statistic, a fact, a date, a quote, I want people to know exactly where that came from. And so you can flick to the back of the book, you can see what document I got that from and what page number I got it from. Of course, that's the reliance then is on the source of the information. So US government, for example, puts out indictments against people. Now, an indictment is an accusation. It's not necessarily proven. That when the person's convicted, if they're convicted, well, then that's proven. But the indictment is the accusation. So again, an official document like an indictment will contain information in it, and I will refer to it. But I'm usually quite careful. I try to be quite careful to say the accusation is this, or this person's alleged to have done that. And you can find that allegation here. But look, as a journalist, you're just having to make an assessment. Who do you trust? How far do you trust them? It's part of the game, and it's surprisingly difficult. I remember in my first book, Crime.com, I was writing about the US presidential election, and it was a very close election in 2016, and I wanted to mention the result. And I thought, well, there must be a website in the US you can go to and they show you the result. But there isn't, because each US state declares individually. There are people who add them up, but there's no, as far as I could work out, there's no US government federal office that gives you the result. And so the figures on a couple of the sites were slightly different. Not so different that it changed the result, but that they had slightly different numbers. And I found this infuriating, because it's like, well, but what's the truth? What is the truth? Eventually, I think I went with the BBC reporting, because they seem to be they seem to match up with most of them. But again, you know, and again, in Lazarus Heist, in this break-in into Bangladesh Bank, in the National Bank of Bangladesh, there was a particular thing that happened. They took over the printer, the hackers took over the printer, so that the printer wasn't going to print out copies of the transactions as they stole the money and tip everybody off. Again, there were two versions of that. Some people said that the printer just didn't print anything. Some people said the printer printed blank pages. And I had both ones from two extremely good sources, one of whom was in Bangladesh Bank, but one of whom had done an extremely accurate technical breakdown, but hadn't been in the bank. Who do I believe? At a certain point, I think as a journalist, you just have to put both things in front of the consumer, the audience, and say, here they are, here's the evidence. I don't know, but you know, this is what I've got. Usually I try and decide, but there are times when I just say, look, I don't know, but here's what I've got. You make your own mind up.
That is phenomenal. Meaning you had to, you went to the extent of checking whether the printer was working or whether, if it was printing white pages. In the end, it did nothing. Meaning it basically had broken down, but you have to go that extra step to even verify that. So this is what goes into writing books and checking then.
Indeed,
Lovely.
yeah. And as I say, it's look, there will always, I don't think any book is without mistakes, and sometimes something can emerge later on that reveals that what you said in the book was mistaken, but you didn't know at the time. So there's always that. But no, we do take it quite seriously. And as I say, it's you really want the thing to stand in stone if you can, and say, look, this is the definitive version. One of the stories I told in Tell and Rinsed is about it's a horrible case in the UK of a man who was he was a child abuser and peddled in child abuse images. Now, I read a lot of reporting about that case, but there were things that were missing from the story. There were gaps in the story. What I can tell you is that in Rinsed, that is the definitive version. The story I tell in Rinsed is, as far as I'm aware, the only complete version of that story from beginning to end. And it was quite important for me, partly because of the victims and seriousness of the case, that I got everything that I told that story and told it fully, because nobody else had. And I thought, this is my responsibility. I've got to tell this story and actually fill in the gaps for people. I'm quite proud of that. But again, who knows? In the future, things may emerge that change your skew. Who knows? Well,
thank you so much, Geoff, for writing Rinsed among the other two books that you've done. And thank you so much for your time on this podcast. It was fun.
Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. The part where you talked about the fact checking, it was. I think I've read this somewhere where if one person says that it's raining outside and the other says it's not raining outside, you don't quote both of them. You open the window and check, verify.
Yeah,
that's what you do then.
It's true. And if you can do that and open the window, great. But if something's happened in the past and it's gone, there's no window to open or the rain has stopped. So yeah, it's you're right. If it's happening at the time, you can do that. Historically, is a different matter. But no, it's fun anyway.
Thanks again.